It was the morning of April 1st, 1984, and a man was standing in the hallway of his parents' house in Los Angeles, trying to stop a fight. He was 44 years old. He had won Grammy Awards. He had sold tens of millions of records. He had been called the greatest singer alive by people who had heard every singer alive. He had made an album that Rolling Stone would one day declare the greatest ever recorded. He had played sold-out arenas on every continent. He had been loved by the world in a way that very few human beings ever experience. But he was standing in a hallway in his parents' house trying to stop a fight. The same way he had been trying to stop fights in that house since he was old enough to understand what was happening. His name was Marvin Gaye, and tomorrow was supposed to be his 45th birthday. He never made it. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, Marvin Gaye Sr., his father, the minister, the man who had raised him with scripture in one hand and a belt in the other, shot his son once in the chest at close range. Marvin was taken to California Hospital Medical Center. He was pronounced dead at 1:01 p.m. He was 44 years old. He had survived addiction. He had survived 2 devastating divorces. He had survived bankruptcy. He had survived years in exile. He had survived the music industry's attempts to contain him, to silence him, to turn him into something smaller and safer than what he actually was. He did not survive his father. But here is the thing that most people do not know. Here is the truth that gets buried under the headlines and the tragedy and the shock of the ending. The bullet that killed Marvin Gaye on April 1st, 1984, did not come from nowhere. It came from a house, from a relationship, from 44 years of love and terror and silence and music and pain that had been building since the day Marvin Pence Gaye Jr. was born into a world that his father controlled absolutely and understood very little. To understand what happened in that hallway, you need to go back to the beginning. Back to Washington, D.C. Back to a house where the same voice that terrified also taught, where the same hands that hurt also prayed, where the most gifted child in the neighborhood learned that love and violence could live in the same room and call themselves family. This is not just the story of how Marvin Gaye died. This is the story of how he lived, and why, despite everything, the music he made in the space between those two things remains the most honest account of what it means to be human that any artist has ever produced. Marvin Pence Gaye Jr. was born on April 2nd, 1939, in Washington, D.C. He came into the world the 4th child of Marvin Gaye Sr. and Alberta Cooper Gaye, in a neighborhood called Shaw that was, like most black neighborhoods in segregated Washington, both a community and a cage. His father was a minister in the House of God, a small Pentecostal sect with strict rules that governed everything from dress to diet to recreation. No drinking, no dancing, no secular music, no jewelry, no deviation from a code that Marvin Gaye Sr. enforced with complete certainty and zero tolerance for negotiation. He was also a man of profound contradictions. He preached sobriety and drank in private. He preached righteousness and kept secrets that no righteous man should carry. He wore women's clothing when no one was watching, a reality that Marvin Jr. discovered as a child and could never fully reconcile with the commanding, immovable figure his father presented to the world. And he hit, not occasionally, not as a last resort, with a regularity that shaped the rhythms of daily life in that house, the way weather shapes life in certain climates, always present, always capable of turning without warning, something you learn to read and predict and try to move around, not because you could stop it, but because sometimes reading it right meant you had a few more minutes of peace. Marvin Jr. was a sensitive child in a house that had no patience for sensitivity. He was artistic in a home that viewed art as vanity. He was gentle in a world that read gentleness as weakness and moved to correct it. He retreated into music. The church, ironically, was his refuge. Marvin Gaye Sr. may have been a tyrant at home, but the music of the house of God, the gospel, the hymns, the call and response, the spirit that moved through a congregation and turned ordinary people momentarily into something that seemed to transcend the ordinary, that music was real. Marvin heard it and felt it and understood instinctively that it was connected to something true, something that existed outside the reach of his father's contradictions and his father's fists. He sang in church before he could read. He harmonized by ear before anyone taught him what harmonizing was. He listened to records when he could find them. Gospel, rhythm and blues, the early stirrings of what would become soul music, and absorbed them completely, the way a child who is starving absorbs food. His mother Alberta was the warmth in that house, patient and soft where Marvin Sr. was rigid and explosive. She worked as a domestic, cleaning other people's homes, and she loved her children with a fierceness that was all the more powerful for being quiet. Marvin idolized her. He called her his angel. He would spend the rest of his life looking for that quality in every relationship he ever had, that unconditional, gentle, complete acceptance, and never quite finding it again, because what Alberta gave him, as real and as sustaining as it was, could not cancel out what Marvin Sr. took away. The damage done in that house on Wyndham Place was the kind that does not announce itself clearly. It does not leave a single visible wound. It leaves instead a particular shape, a way of moving through the world with one eye always watching for the door to change, one part of yourself always braced for the blow that may or may not be coming, a permanent low-level vigilance that never fully switches off. That vigilance would eventually become the most distinctive quality in Marvin Gaye's art. That ability to hold tenderness and terror in the same breath. To sing about love with the knowledge that love can also destroy you. To make music that felt simultaneously like an embrace and a confession of everything that made embraces complicated. It started in that house, in that childhood, in the gap between who his father pretended to be and what his father actually was. Part 2. The Escape and the Echo. Marvin dropped out of school at 17 and joined the Air Force. He did not want to be a soldier. He wanted to be out of Washington. He wanted to be out of that house, out of the reach of his father's authority, out of the atmosphere of controlled fear that had been the air he breathed for his entire childhood. The Air Force did not work out. The military's demand for obedience triggered the same response in Marvin that his father's authority always had, a deep, instinctive resistance that he could not override no matter how hard he tried. He deliberately got himself discharged by faking psychiatric symptoms. He came home with nothing but his voice and a hunger he could not name precisely but recognized as the thing that had been with him since the first time he stood in that church choir and understood that music was the one place where nobody could tell him what to do or who to be. He sang in doo-wop groups in Washington. He moved around. He absorbed everything he heard. He made his way eventually to Detroit, to Harvey Fuqua and the Moonglows, and from there to a modest house on West Grand Boulevard with a sign out front that said Hitsville, USA. Berry Gordy signed Marvin Gaye to Motown in 1961, and what happened next is a story most people think they know. The hits. Stubborn Kind of Fellow, Hitchhike, Pride and Joy, How Sweet It Is. A string of polished, perfectly constructed pop songs that climbed the charts and made Marvin Gaye a household name and made Berry Gordy a great deal of money. But here is what the hits concealed. Here is what the smooth Motown production always papered over. Marvin Gaye was not at peace. He was performing peace. He was performing joy. He was standing in front of microphones and delivering exactly what the machine required of him, and doing it brilliantly and feeling, underneath it all, a restlessness that no amount of commercial success could quiet. Because the thing about growing up in a house like the one on Wyndham Place is that you learn to perform. You learn to read what the room needs and give it that, regardless of what is actually happening inside you. You learn to be one thing on the outside while carrying something entirely different within. That is a survival skill. In childhood, it keeps you safe. In adulthood, it makes you a brilliant performer and a profoundly lonely human being. Marvin was both. He married Anna Gordy, Berry's sister, in 1963. She was 17 years older than him. She was sophisticated and strong and connected to the center of the Motown universe. The marriage was complicated from its first day, a collision of genuine affection and mutual need that contained within it the seeds of the bitterness that would eventually consume it. But for a while it worked. For a while it gave Marvin something that resembled the stability he had never had on Wyndham Place. What it could not give him was the freedom to say what was actually inside him. That would require a catastrophe. His best friend Tammy Terrell collapsed in his arms on stage in October 1967, She fell mid-performance at Hampden-Sydney College in Virginia, unconscious, and Marvin caught her. Brain tumor. 8 operations over the next 3 years. Death in March 1970 at 24 years old. Marvin did not handle it. He could not. The depression that followed was not the kind you push through with work and willpower. It was the kind that stops everything. He withdrew from performing. He spent months barely leaving his room. He stopped eating properly. He stopped returning calls. The man who had been one of Motown's most reliable earners became someone the label could not reach. But something was happening in that darkness. Something was forming. His brother Frankie came home from Vietnam and sat in Marvin's living room and talked for hours about things that the government was not telling the American public. Things that no record Marvin had made for Motown had ever addressed. Things that were happening in real time to real people, in Vietnam, in the streets of American cities, in the lives of black men who came home from a war and found nothing waiting for them except poverty and indifference. Marvin listened, and everything he heard went into the wound that Tammy's death had opened. And in that wound, in that terrible fertile darkness, something began to grow that would eventually become the most important album in the history of American popular music. He called it What's Going On. Berry Gordy called it the worst record he had ever heard. He refused to release it. What happened next has been told before, but it bears telling again because the specifics matter. Marvin Gaye did not argue. He did not compromise. He did not soften the edges to make it more palatable. He told Gordy with complete calm that he would never record another song for Motown if What's Going On was not released exactly as he had made it. The ultimatum worked. The album came out in May 1971. It went to #1. It sold over 1 million copies in its first year. It changed what soul music was allowed to say and how it was allowed to say it. But inside the triumph, something darker was still moving. Success did not feel like what Marvin had imagined it would feel like. The marriage to Anna ended in a divorce that was brutal in every dimension: emotional, financial, legal. The settlement required Marvin to give Anna the royalties from his next album. His response was to make an album called Here, My Dear, a raw, unflinching, sometimes cruel examination of the marriage and its disintegration, and dedicate it directly to her. It was one of the strangest things any major artist had ever done. It was also one of the most honest. He fell in love with Janice Hunter, 17 years old, when he met her during the recording of Let's Get It On in 1973. He married her after the divorce from Anna was finalized. That marriage produced 2 children and eventually another devastating collapse. He was using cocaine through the late 1970s with a regularity that alarmed everyone around him and that he could not find a reason compelling enough to stop. The music slowed. The personal life became increasingly chaotic. The man who had made What's Going On, who had stood up to Motown and told the truth about the world, was disappearing into something that looked like self-destruction from the outside and felt, from the inside, like the only thing making the noise stop. He moved to Europe, London first, then Ostend in Belgium, a small city on the North Sea coast where nobody knew his name, and the sky was almost always gray, and he could sit in a rented apartment and be nobody for a while. In Ostend, he made an album called In Our Lifetime, fractured and brilliant and deeply personal, about the war he felt inside himself between the sacred and the profane, between the boy who had stood in the church choir and felt God move through him, and the man who had spent years doing things that God probably did not approve of. Motown released it without his consent and altered it without his knowledge. He never forgave them. He signed with Columbia. He went back into the studio in Ostend and found something he had thought might be gone forever. A melody, a feeling, a song about a different kind of longing. He called it Sexual Healing. It went to #1. It won 2 Grammys. It reminded the world, in case anyone had forgotten, that Marvin Gaye was still one of the greatest artists alive. He came home. He went on tour. The Midnight Love Tour in 1983 was a triumph. Sold-out arenas, standing ovations, a man performing at the peak of his powers, looking and sounding like someone who had come through fire and emerged changed but intact. He should have stayed on the road. He should have stayed in that version of himself, the performer, the artist, the man whose voice made everything else make sense. Instead, he moved back in with his parents. The decision made no sense to anyone who knew him. He was a superstar coming off the biggest commercial comeback of his career. He had options. He had money. He had every reason to go anywhere in the world except back to the house where the story had started. But Marvin Gaye was not making rational decisions in the fall of 1983. He was using cocaine heavily. He was in a deep depression that the tour's success had temporarily masked but not resolved. He was, by multiple accounts, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical, exhausted of the distance he had maintained from everything that had hurt him, exhausted of performing health he did not feel, exhausted of being Marvin Gaye in the way the world needed him to be. And underneath all of it, as it always had been, was his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., the minister, the man with the contradictions and the secrets and the hands that knew how to hurt. Marvin had spent his entire adult life trying to outrun that house, that relationship, that foundational wound. And here he was, at 44, walking back through the door. The people around him were terrified. His mother, Alberta, still the warmth in that family, was terrified. His sister Zola was terrified. They had watched what happened in that house for decades. They knew what the atmosphere between Marvin and his father could become, but Marvin went anyway. Because here is the thing that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has not lived it. Sometimes you go back. Sometimes the very place that hurt you the most is the place you return to when you are broken. Not because you have forgotten what it cost you, but because some part of you is still trying to resolve it, still trying to find the ending that did not happen the first time. Still looking for the version of your father who might, this time, see you clearly. Marvin Gaye Sr. was not going to become that man. He was in his 70s. He was in poor health. He was, in his own way, as lost as his son, a man who had built his entire identity on control and authority, watching both of those things slip away from him as his body failed and his relevance faded. He and Marvin argued constantly. About money, about living arrangements, about things so small they barely registered as reasons for the fights they became. The house on Gramercy Place in Los Angeles became, again, what the house on Wyndham Place had always been. A place where love and violence occupied the same rooms and called themselves family. Part 6. April 1st, 1984. The day before Marvin's 45th birthday, the argument that mourning was about papers. Documents that Marvin Gaye Sr. believed had been misplaced. Letters or insurance papers, the exact content varying depending on who told the story later. What is consistent across every account is the escalation, the way the argument moved from words to something physical, the way Alberta tried to intervene, the way Marvin stepped between his parents, the way he had stepped between them countless times across 44 years. He was trying to protect his mother. He had always been trying to protect his mother, but this time something was different. This time, Marvin fought back. He hit his father, hard enough to knock him down, hard enough that Marvin Gaye Sr., when he got up, went to his room and retrieved the gun. It was a gun that Marvin himself had given his father as a gift months earlier, a .38 caliber revolver that Marvin had bought thinking it would make his parents feel safer in the house. Marvin Gaye Sr. came back into the hallway. He shot his son once in the chest. Then he shot him again. Marvin Gaye was taken to California Hospital Medical Center. He was pronounced dead at 1:01 p.m. on April 1st, 1984. He was 44 years old, one day before he would have turned 45. A coroner's examination later discovered that Marvin had enough cocaine in his system that he may have been experiencing cocaine-induced paranoia during the confrontation. A subsequent examination of Marvin Gaye Sr. revealed a meningioma, a brain tumor, that doctors believed had been affecting his behavior for some time, contributing to increased aggression and disinhibition. Marvin Gaye Sr. was charged with first-degree murder. The charge was later reduced to voluntary manslaughter. He received a 6-year suspended sentence. He died in 1998, having served no prison time. He outlived his son by 14 years. Part 7. What the music knew. Here is what haunts me about the story of Marvin Gaye and his father. The music knew, not in a mystical sense, not in a way that requires you to believe in prophecy or fate, but in the way that great art always knows, because great art comes from a real place, from real experience, from a real person who has felt real things and found a way to transmit those feelings without diluting them. Listen to what's going on with the knowledge of where it came from. Not just from Vietnam and police brutality and environmental destruction, though it came from all of those things. Listen to it as the work of a man who learned in childhood that the world could be brutal and beautiful in the same moment, that the people who were supposed to protect you were capable of the very violence they claimed to be shielding you from. Father, Father, there's far too many of you dying. He was not just singing about Vietnam. He was singing about something older and more personal and more devastating. He was singing about fathers and sons and the terrible mathematics of love and harm that can bind them together across an entire lifetime. Listen to Let's Get It On and hear not just desire but desperation. The sound of a man who had learned that closeness was dangerous and was reaching for it anyway, unable to stop himself, unable to choose safety over the terrifying vulnerability of genuine connection. Listen to Here, My Dear, the divorce album, the strange, brutal, beautiful account of a marriage ending, and hear what it sounds like when a man decides to stop performing and simply tell the truth, even when the truth is unflattering, even when it costs him the thing he is trying to hold on to. Listen to Sexual Healing and hear what survival sounds like when it surprises you. When you thought you were finished and the music comes back and proves you wrong. Every album Marvin Gaye ever made contains the house on Wyndham Place inside it, contains his father's contradictions and his mother's gentleness, and the gap between them. The gap that Marvin spent his entire life trying to bridge with music, with love, with drugs, with faith, with everything he had. He could not bridge it. Nobody could have bridged it. It was not the kind of gap that closes, but he made the most extraordinary music anyone has ever made from standing at the edge of it and looking down. More than 40 years after his death, Marvin Gaye's music does something that very little music manages to do. It finds you where you are, not where you are supposed to be. Not where the world needs you to be, where you actually are. In the complicated, unresolved, imperfectly understood middle of your own story. Still trying to figure out how to love and be loved without destroying yourself in the process. That is what the music is about. Underneath the soul and the gospel and the politics and the desire and the grief, it is about that. About the fundamental human difficulty of being in relationship with other people, when those relationships are capable of both sustaining you and tearing you apart. He learned that in a house in Washington, D.C., he spent 44 years trying to make something beautiful out of what he learned there. And he succeeded in the most complete and irreversible way a person can succeed at anything, because what he made will outlast everyone who was in that house, everyone who hurt him, everyone who loved him, everyone who failed to understand what they had until it was gone. What's going on? Let's Get It On. Mercy, Mercy Me. Inner City Blues. Sexual Healing. Ain't No Mountain High Enough. I heard it through the grapevine. A body of work so large and so consistent and so deeply, irreducibly human that it constitutes something close to a complete account of what it felt like to be alive in the second half of the 20th century. Made by a man who grew up being told that what he felt did not matter, who proved with every note he ever sang that it was the only thing that did. Marvin Gaye was born on April 2nd, 1939. He died on April 1st, 1984. One day before his 45th birthday. In the same kind of house he had always been trying to escape, but the music escaped. The music got out. The music is still out there, still traveling, still finding people in dark rooms and quiet moments and unexpected places, and doing what Marvin Gaye spent his whole life doing, telling the truth, in a way that makes the truth feel, somehow, like the beginning of something rather than the end. If this story moved you, if you felt something hearing about a man who turned the most painful parts of his life into the most beautiful music ever made, subscribe and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that what you have survived is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of what you have to say. Leave a comment telling us, what does Marvin Gaye's music mean to you? Ring that notification bell so you never miss another story about the legends who changed music forever. We will see you in the next one.